Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Brant Gardner. He's the author of Plates of Mormon, as well as Engraven Upon Plates, written on paper. We're going to talk a little bit about 19th century artifacts in the Book of Mormon. We'll also talk about Deuteronomy, Adam Clark, and and the printer's manuscript. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Welcome back to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have Brant Gardner back in. You know, last time we talked, we didn't have enough time, and so he's back in town. And so we're going to talk more about his amazing. Well, you still got the two books. Why don't you introduce the two books to our people, just in case they didn't hear the first part?
Yeah, as long as we don't have to do subtitles, because I forget what the subtitles are. So, one is called Engraven Upon Plates, Printed Upon Paper. That looks, and it's easier for me to explain it if I tell you what the title used to be before Koford made me change it. Because they didn't like it. My original title was Textual Archaeology.
Oh, wow.
And conceptually, what I'm doing in that book is looking at the layers of the creation of the text, and I'm saying, let's dive down. And for example, it is indisputable that there is a 19th century textual layer.
Yeah.
It's in English. It wasn't in English originally, no matter what else you think about it. And so the question then becomes, if it was created in different time periods, so there's an English text that was created in the 18th century, it claims, of course, that there is a more ancient text, and then they claim that they worked with other texts. As you go back through it, the question then becomes what things can be assigned to each layer? What parts of the text belong to the 18th century? And when you look at them, you say, oh, that looks like the 18th century. Well, yeah, it is. There isn't anything about the text. It just says, yeah, it was produced in the 18th or 19th century. And then you move to a lower layer. And so that's what that book is about. It's saying it was engraven upon plates, that's the old one, and then printed upon paper, that's the newer layer. And so the concept is that there is something that occurred when the text was translated into English. There was a text from which it was translated, and there are elements of the text that I believe can be reasonably assigned to that layer rather than the 19th century. And then there's the lower layer, which is, okay, they worked with certain texts. What did those things look like? What can we learn about what these guys did from a source that they had? So that's what that book's about. And it's mechanics, it's elements, it's structure. It looks at why do we have chapters? Why do book names change in Mormon's text? And we get used to Nephi's small plates, and we know why the names change. It's Nephi, or then it's Jacob, or then it's Jerem, and the guy who's writing, until you get to the Book of Omni, where everybody writes in the Book of Omni. But until then, it's one person, and then you get to Mormon, and you have Mosiah, who the first person we meet in the Book of Mosiah is Benjamin.
Yeah, that's kind of.
But then we get his son Mosiah,
right?
And we think, it's Mosiah, the grandfather, is the one who would have started that book. And then you get the Book of Alma. Well, Alma has some in it. Well, no, the Book of Mosiah also has the story of Alma the Elder, and so then we get Alma the Younger, and then after that we get some of Helaman writing, Alma's son, but we don't change the book name. We get a Helaman, but that's the next Helaman. That's the grandson. And so we have all these names that change, but you don't know why. So the book talks about that. And you can ask me, I'll tell you. But those are the kinds of questions that it looks like. Why do chapters end? When has Mormon had enough of a chapter and says, okay, that's good. I'll stop and go do another one. We have headers at the beginning of books. We also have headers at the beginning of chapters. What are they doing there? Why do some chapters have headers, but others don't? What is the nature of the header in the book? So it's all those kind of crazy little details.
Well, and I guess it's important to note that the current chapter headers most of them are from Bruce R. McConkie, right?
Yes.
And so the original Book of Mormon did have some chapter headings, but there were many fewer chapters than in our current book.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that's really important to remember. And when I get to the next Life, Orson Pratt and I are going to have a conversation.
Okay.
Because I think he did not do us any great services by chopping up the original chapters. You have to put them back in the original to understand what's going on.
Huh. Now, is that what you did? Because you got the two books.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the second one, I took the information on the printer's manuscript,
right,
that does not have any paragraphing, basically nothing there. And basically, when I started it, I said, they gave this to John Gilbert and said, make a book out of it. And I've read the Book of Mormon more times than John Gilbert has. And I said, well, what would I do? Mm-hmm. And it started as just kind of that project. But the way it evolved, I was doing this other work on the text. And so I said, oh, well, let me format this the way I think it was intended to be formatted based on someone who doesn't have written punctuation. So if you go back to a culture that is writing, but you haven't got far enough into writing that you've developed punctuation, what do? Well, you do what you did when you were saying things orally. We always divide up long speeches, texts, and we do things to help our audience understand what the divisions are. And so they did. And one of the ones that they used, we know extremely well because it's called "And It Came to Pass." And it turns out that "And It Came to Pass" is extremely functional in the Book of Mormon. And although they have taken some of those out in our current editions, not like the French edition where they took them all out because the French are really kind of unhappy with those. I put them all back in because I think they're extremely important. I think they were part of what's supposed to be there. For those who are wondering, "And It Came to Pass" moves the text along through history. It's an event. And if you're speaking and there's nothing written, you say, and it came to pass, this happened, to whatever it was. Then this happened. Then this happened. And that's what we would say if we were speaking. Well, that's what they do. And it came to pass, boom, here's what happened. And it came to pass, and you just move that down through time. And then if you want to say, and something else happened at the same time, it uses "and now." And so you get "and it came to pass, and now," same time period, and then you get another "it came to pass," and it moves. And when you break up the text and you use those as paragraph markers, it reads differently than it does when you paragraph it the way an English professor would paragraph it. And I showed Grant Hardy some of that, and he says, oh, those are way too short of paragraphs for me. And he's right, but that wasn't the reason that they're there. It's not there for modern sensibilities. It's for the sensibility of, what is this doing there? Why is that in the text? So anyway, when I did the Book of Mormon, this now it's called Plates of Mormon, with some subtext that I can't remember.
Okay.
Yeah,
and that starts in Mosiah, goes to...
Yeah, that's the other thing that we
Moroni,
did.
Or do you...
It goes through the Words of Mormon, and then goes to the small plates.
Okay.
To Nephi.
So Mosiah all the way through Moroni, and then Words of Mormon, and then 1st and 2nd Nephi. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and the concept there is, and it came out of discussions I was having with Lloyd at Coford Books. And I said, I really wish that we wouldn't read the Book of Mormon starting with Nephi, because what happens is we get a lot of our assumptions about the text, and particularly about Lamanites, from Nephi, and we carry those over into Mormon's text as though they were the same and they were the same ideas, and as though we're supposed to see Lamanites the same way that we saw them in the book of Nephi. And Mormon doesn't want us to see them that way at all. It's a very, very different perspective, and Mormon is doing something extremely different, but we don't see it because we start with Nephi and we get accustomed to his view and then push that onto Mormon. And if we started with Mormon, then we'd have a better idea of what Mormon was doing before we got back to, oh yeah, here's what Nephi did that was a totally separate thing, was never intended to be the beginning of the Book of Mormon at all. So another thing that we did is we put in a placeholder for the Book of Lehi. We obviously don't have that. It was lost. But there's a page there that I think we used Joseph Smith's introduction to the lost pages. And then there's another page that's an introduction to the fact that we're missing the beginning of the Book of Mosiah.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a placeholder.
Joe Spencer argues with that, though. He thinks we have it all.
Yeah, he's wrong, but that's all right.
Joe's wrong.
Joe's wrong. Joe's wrong. And Joe, if you're listening, we'll have a conversation. In fact, we talked a little bit at Education Week.
Okay.
And he said something, and I think it was that topic. And I said, well, I completely disagree with you. We'll have to have a conversation. He says, yeah, we need to talk. So yes, and it is an absolutely wonderful thing when you have two scholars disagreeing.
Mm-hmm.
Put the information out there. Let people understand. And when you do, you'll find out I was right. So anyway, so those are the two books. One of them looking at what I originally thought was textual archaeology, going down through the layers and saying what belongs in this creation layer of the text. And then the second saying, well, let's take some of those principles and reformat. And then what I did when I was doing the rest of the Book of Mormon, so we have the placeholder for the Book of Lehi, placeholder for Mosiah, get all the way through. It makes a difference, oddly enough, when you see words of Mormon at the end of the book before you get to the small plates.
Okay.
Because they're an introduction to the small plates.
Right.
And seeing it there shifts your perspective a little. And then other things that I did that are different. Royal Skousen has done the earliest text where he took the information of what he thought Joseph spoke and put that together, published by Yale Press. Very impressive, really important work. But because all of his work on figuring out what he wanted, what he thought should be the original there is all in these 7 volumes worth of massive stuff, he didn't tell the readers of the earliest text a lot of when he made choices and why he made them. And I decided I'd do that. And, there are times when you have to say, okay, this is what the printer's manuscript said, but there's a better reading in the original. We have the original.
Oh.
And so you go back to the original, but you note that. So if some scholar, go ahead.
Which one was the one that was mostly destroyed? That was the original?
Yes.
Okay, so we've only got 28% of the original manuscript.
Yeah.
Tell us why that was.
Well, 2 reasons. One of them, they put it in the corner of the Nauvoo house, and the cornerstone leaked, and it got wet and destroyed. The other reason is Emma, Joseph's wife, got remarried to Bideman, and they would have people come, and as we call them party favors or whatever, he gave away pages. People would come, and he'd say, yeah, would you like a page of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon? Oh, yeah, I'd love to have a page.
Yeah, no kidding.
And so he just pulled off pages and handed them out. And some of those have been preserved in private collections. Some of them just totally lost, of course.
Right.
And anyone who is seriously interested in the original manuscript has to get the Joseph Smith Papers volume on the original, because they got all of the scraps that they could find and just did a wonderful collection where they could take the scraps and find out, okay, this scrap goes here and this one goes here. And then they have grayed out text behind it so you know where it fits in the Book of Mormon. I mean, it is a wonderful, wonderful presentation of what we have left. And frankly, you look at it and you go, boy, that's it. That's all we've got. But yeah, fascinating. But when I did the Plates of Mormon, I decided that people ought to know. And there were a couple of places where you don't know what the original was, and there's kind of smeared ink or something on the printers. And so you kind of have to guess what it was. And there's a couple of possibilities. And so I would note those.
Uh-huh.
So for people who don't want to go through 7 volumes, this will give them a little bit better flavor. And then another thing that I did in that one, well, 2 more things I did in that one. One of them, I have learned that both Mormon and Nephi, and lesser in the rest of the small plates, they would have asides. They'd be writing along and something would trip their mind or something. And Nephi did this more as, oh, I was talking about that, and his mind just kind of wanders off. And then he inserts this stuff. And then he has to kind of pull himself. It was the original gospel tangent. I mean, you want to go back to where the source of the name came from. It's Nephi. He was on tangents frequently. The most famous of which is the Psalm of Nephi. Psalm of Nephi is spontaneous. When you read through that thing and what comes up, he's talking about the death of his father. And thinking about that turns into this lament. And there's some really nice poetic features in there. There's parallelism, solid parallel. I can't remember. Anyway, the two lines are parallel, but then there's antithetical parallel where the second line is the reverse of the first. There isn't an overall structure that you can look at where you can say, oh yeah, he's doing this great chiasm of this long thing, or here's a structured. It's his literary competence in his language that is coming out and getting these poetic parallels. And it's really, really nice, but he's just doing this spontaneously. He never planned that as part of his text. And then he has to kind of yank himself back in. And he does that several times. So I tried to set those aside so that a reader could say, oh yeah, he's kind of off course here. And then he'll work his way back. Mormon does a little bit where he gets slightly off course, but he typically doesn't. Mormon usually, his insertions are, and thus we can see, it's sort of like, just in case you didn't get the message, here's the message. And then in a couple of places, he inserts things that are really kind of out of place, but it's sort of like, okay, here's information you really need to have. And an example of one of them, the most famous one that everybody would know about, is all of the weights and measures in the beginning of Alma, chapter 11. Where it just goes on, and we read it, and our eyes glass. I don't care what all these things are, on ties and all of the rest. And what's fascinating about that, you don't see it as well because of Orson Pratt. He split off the beginning of that where you see Mormon say, here's sort of the thing I want to talk about. And what he does is use a principle called repetitive resumption. Once you insert a text, to get back to what you wanted to say, you repeat some of this text. And so he repeats it down there. And it's, almost a chapter away. And it's, the beginning is separated from the beginning of that, so you don't even notice that it's there. But this long inserted text. And then, of course, the reason is, why would you undo that? And Gordon Thomason was the guy who I think came up with the key to it. And he said, this is so that we will understand the way he uses names. And so you have an ontai, which is, a measurement, and then you have antionum, and you have an Ezram, and then you have Zeezram. And basically, when you read it, Alma and Amulek are going there, and the first guy that comes to combat them is the silver guy. And then they go to the gold guy. And it's sort of like, oh yeah, now the big guy comes in. And these names are being used. And you wouldn't know that if you didn't have that insertion, so that you knew why Mormon was using the names that way. Huh. And Antionum, by the way, is where the Zoramites are. It's the only time where we have the Zoramites, and we talk about the Zoramites, and they live in Antionum. We don't talk about the Antionumites. So there's some crazy thing going on there with the naming and the people and everything else. But anyway, so I set those aside. I thought that was important for a reader to see those things. And then the other is in things like the Isaiah sections. We all know, or should know, that Joseph Smith added a few words here and there. And depending on your theory of translation, it was Joseph or somebody else. But, the text is slightly different. But we missed the fact that he also cut some words out. He frequently took some of the words that were in italics and got rid of them.
Okay.
So I put blank brackets in to indicate that there's a missing word there. And then I'd have a footnote in the bracket to say, okay, here's what was removed from the text.
Okay.
So things like what Grant Hardy does in both his Reader's Edition and his annotated, he will mark what the additions are, but you don't know what the deletions are, the subtractions.
Okay.
So, it's... There was a review of that particular book on the Association for Mormon Literature, and kind of the final line that the guy said was, this really shouldn't be your first Book of Mormon. And I agree with that. It was not written for somebody who isn't a member of the church, who isn't interested in, learning more about the text itself. There's a reason that you go there. So just like Skousen's earliest text, that shouldn't be your first one either. But I think if you're in the scholarly world trying to learn something about the text, I think there's some things there that can be interesting and useful. And if it's this third or fourth or 31st time you've read the Book of Mormon, and you need to have it look different and feel different so that you see things you've never seen before just because they're different on the page, then this one's for you.
So, one of my favorite personal copies of the Book of Mormon is a replica first edition, because it really is in paragraph form, and that's what you've tried to do as well with yours.
Yes, but the original is in 1830 paragraph form.
Right.
And they're in 1830 sentences, which can be an entire paragraph. They really didn't mind long sentences. Modern readers don't like sentences that are that long. So I intentionally made them shorter if I could. And in some cases, there are a lot of internal phrases. It's almost asides inside the sentence. And some of those I put in parentheses to make it easier for a reader to know, this is not the main thought of the sentence. I'm allowed to say, okay, this is the sub-sentence, and then I can get back to the regular one.
And I noticed you put a lot of dashes in there instead of semicolons. It seems like John Gilbert probably put a lot of semicolons in.
Yeah.
But we would use dashes to be like, I'm kind of interrupting my thought here.
There is somewhere in the back of my mind, and I changed some of it as I was going through, but one of the original thoughts was that it was a text that somebody really ought to read out loud. That's how it was dictated. It did not ever begin with paragraphs, in the Nephite text. We don't know quite what it was, but certainly by the time Joseph is dictating, he's just dictating. And I think sometimes when we're speaking, you'll come to a pause and you will kind of hold over the thought. Well, there's where the dashes come in. The dashes aren't ending a thought. They're not closing things off. They're saying, and every once in a while it's for emphasis. And I could see a speaker doing that kind of thing where they're standing up and they give a pregnant pause. There's a reason that pause is there. And it's not just punctuation. It's an emotional connection to what the sentence is doing. So I used a lot of those things way back in many earlier lives. I was a debater and did things speech related. So I have some sensibility to what people try to do when they're in front of an audience. And so I tried to get some of that in there.
Yeah. One of the cool footnotes that I saw, and I guess I was probably Royal Skousen that came up with this, but it was cool that you brought it in there, was, and we were talking off camera beforehand that, Joseph had a New England accent.
Yes.
And so if anybody from the church history department is listening, I think that when you portray Joseph Smith, he should sound like John F. Kennedy. And the Whitmers should sound German. I think they've done that a little bit. And John Taylor needs to sound like he's from England. Because it's just more...
it's more real.
Authentic. Yeah. But one of the footnotes was... concerning Zeniff, Zeniff, the scribe. I don't remember who the scribe was. It might have been Oliver Cowdery. wrote Zenith, Zenith,
Yeah.
because that's what it sounded like. I thought that was hilarious because I could just hear Joseph saying Zenith, but it sounded like Zenith, and it was,
one of the ones that the more I thought about it and realized that, we're getting an oral thing here, we have worked forever to try and figure out why we have anti-Nephi Lehis.
Right.
What are they anti? And if you look through the text, it just doesn't look like anti is supposed to mean anti. And then I started looking at some of these. Mormon tells long stories. He has long arcs that he works with. And as I was looking at those, I realized that he tells the story of the anti-Nephi Lehis, and he gets all of the information. And then later on, he tells the story of two brothers, Nephi and Lehi, who go to the Lamanites and convert Lamanites just like this first group did. And the first group lays down their weapons of war. The second group lays down their weapons of war. Well, the names are always Nephi and Lehi in the later one. What if they aren't named anti, but I'm saying to you, well, these are the anti-Nephi Lehis. I'll get them right, And I mean anti instead of anti.
Oh.
What if it's the before? What if it's the earlier version of this story? And Mormon really wants us to understand those two stories are parallel. What if it really is the anti-Nephi Lehis, and because it's anti, it got written down as anti instead of
anti? Yeah.
And so and because it's Lehi, Nephi Lehi, I never could figure out, even if it was anti, no matter what else you did with anti, why is it Nephi Lehi and not Lehi Nephi? Lehi came first,
right?
But not in the brothers from the later story. In the later story, it's always Nephi and then his brother Lehi.
Right.
So maybe, who knows?
Yeah.
And I think I put that in there so that it's a footnote and somebody can decide they like it or not. I thought it was a pretty good idea.
Well, cool. So that's really interesting. So it's called Plates of Nephi. What's it called?
Plates of Mormon.
Plates of Mormon.
Yeah, Plates of Mormon. That's the one that's the text. That's the Book of Mormon.
It's basically a study Book of Mormon.
Yes.
And you've got your own footnotes and you've formatted the paragraphs and everything. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Brant Gardner. He's the author of Plates of Mormon. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Israelite polytheism and chiasmus.
I'm going to get myself in trouble in this answer.
I know, that's what we're all about.
Yeah, thanks. If they're excommunicating me next week, it'll be your fault. I have a problem with many Latter-day Saint apologists because their immediate reaction to something that sounds bad about the Book of Mormon or Joseph's translation or anything else, something really looks like it might be damaging. There is a knee-jerk reaction to just deny it and pretend that it doesn't exist and do whatever they can to push back on it. This is one of them.
Oh, okay. Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt, so check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.